the transition from colonial to informal empire. The end of World War II didn't just redraw borders. It fundamentally changed how global power worked. For centuries before 1945, imperial dominance followed a familiar pattern. European powers conquered territory, ruled it directly, extracted their resources, and enforced control through their administrations. Empires were visible. Their authority was explicit. Their violence was overt. But World War II broke that system. Britain, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, and other imperial states emerged from the war economically drained and politically weakened. Their industrial centers had been bombed, their national debts were enormous, their populations were exhausted and increasingly unwilling to pay the cost of maintaining overseas empires. At the same time, colonized people were no longer willing to accept imperial rule. Millions had been conscripted to fight in European wars under promises of freedom and self-determination, promises that were rarely kept. Anti-colonial movements surged across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Independence was no longer a fringe demand. It was a mass political force. The old model of empire, direct colonial control, had become unsustainable. It was expensive, violent, and increasingly indefensible in a world that now spoke the language of human rights. Ideas of national sovereignty and democracy shattered this. The moral legitimacy of empire collapsed almost as quickly as its economic foundations. Now this created a vacuum, and into this vacuum stepped the United States. Unlike Europe, the U.S. emerged from World War II not weakened, but strengthened. Its mainland had been untouched by bombing. Its factories had expanded massively to support the war effort. Its military had gained unparalleled global reach. And perhaps most importantly, its economy had become the central engine of global reconstruction. By the late 1940s, the United States produced an extraordinary share of the world's industrial output. It held the majority of global gold reserves, and through agreements like Bretton Woods, it positioned the U.S. dollar as the foundation of the international financial system. This was not just an accident. It was a strategic and planned-out reordering of the entire world. The collapse of European empires created a dilemma for American policymakers. On one hand, the U.S. publicly opposed traditional colonialism. It framed itself as anti-imperial, born from a revolution against empire. On the other hand, American leaders were deeply invested in preventing newly independent nations from pursuing economic or political paths that challenged U.S. interests. The solution was not to replace European empires with an American one in the old sense, but to invent a new kind of imperial system. One that didn't rely on colonies, one that didn't require governors or viceroys, one that allowed the U.S. to shape global outcomes while maintaining the appearance of respecting national sovereignty. This is where the modern American-led system takes shape. Instead of colonizing territory, the United States built a global network of military bases. These bases were framed as defensive, temporary, or cooperative, but collectively, they gave the U.S. permanent force projection across nearly every region of the world. A base does not need to govern a country to influence it. Its presence alters political calculations. It ties local security to American strategy. It creates long-term dependency relationships that are difficult to unwind. Instead of colonial administrators, the U.S. relied on alliances and client states. Countries were offered military protection, economic aid, and diplomatic support in exchange for alignment with U.S. priorities. These relationships were often formalized through treaties, but the balance of power within them was rarely equal. Allies had sovereignty, but only within boundaries that did not threaten American strategic interests. Instead of extracting resources through direct rule, the U.S. promoted trade agreements and global markets structured around American economic dominance. Access to U.S. markets, investment capital, and financial institutions became a powerful incentive for compliance. This system allowed the U.S. to benefit from global labor and resources without administering foreign populations directly. Costs were externalized, responsibility was diffused, control remained intact. Most crucially, however, this model came with plausible deniability. When things went wrong, the U.S. could claim it was respecting sovereignty. When governments collapsed, it could frame events as internal instability. When violence erupted, it could describe itself as a reluctant responder rather than the instigator. This is just empire without the branding. The Cold War accelerated this transformation. As decolonization spread, Washington viewed the newly independent world not as a neutral territory, but as a battleground. The fear was not that these nations would be conquered by the Soviet Union, but that they might choose economic models that rejected Western capitalism. Independence, acceptable. Non-alignment is not. So the U.S. invested heavily in shaping post-colonial states. It funded their political parties, trained their militaries, advised their governments, and intervened, both covertly and overtly, when outcomes deviated too far from its preferences. What made this system especially effective was that it presented itself as the opposite of empire. The U.S. framed its leadership as benevolent, rules-based, and necessary for global stability. It spoke the language of freedom while reserving the right to intervene when freedom produced the wrong results. This dual narrative, anti-imperial rhetoric paired with imperial practice, became a defining feature of American power. And because the U.S. did not formally rule most of the world, many people concluded that it did not dominate it. But domination does not require ownership. By the mid-20th century, the United States had positioned itself as the manager of the global system. It set the rules of the trade. It defined security threats. It controlled access to the financial lifelines, and it reserved the authority to intervene anywhere at any time in the name of order. America didn't need colonies because it had something more flexible and resilient, a system of managed dependence. Countries were free, but only to the extent that their freedom aligned with U.S. interests. Economic development was encouraged, but only within acceptable frameworks. Political diversity was tolerated, but up to a point. This is why the phrase American empire often feels misleading. Empires conjure images of ownership and rule. What the U.S. constructed after World War II was something closer to global administration. It didn't rule the world in the traditional sense. It managed it. And management, unlike rule, is harder to see. It's harder to name, and it's harder to resist. Because when power presents itself as neutral coordination rather than pure domination, it becomes embedded in the background of global life. It becomes the default, and the default is what does not get questioned. That is the legacy of the post-World War II transition, not the end of an empire, but its evolution into a form better suited to a world that claims to oppose it.